Get her out of my sight. Now. The command didn't leave his lips aloud. It detonated inside Arthur Sterling's head like the primal roar of a cornered animal. It wasn't a calm directive, but an instinctive panic, the kind that erupts when something threatens to unravel everything. In his eyes, she wasn't a person. She was a blemish on a flawless pane of glass, a jarring wrong note in the symphony of power he had orchestrated for weeks. Worse still, that blemish took the shape of a black woman in a silver-gray uniform, standing in the grand lobby of the Pinnacle Grand like a lone minor chord in an orchestra playing all in major key. Arthur was in the heart of his dominion, the main lobby of one of New York's most prestigious five-star hotels. This was where billion-dollar deals were sealed, political alliances were cultivated, and careers were obliterated with a single glance. Yet today, the space felt hostile. The massive crystal chandelier overhead no longer glittered as a symbol of opulence, but hung suspended like a dead star, looming in silent judgment. The Italian marble beneath his feet was as cold as a tombstone, reflecting his own pale, tight face as though etching a sentence into stone. The imported white orchid fragrance from Singapore, normally a hallmark of sophistication, now felt acrid and suffocating, like the scent of failure creeping in. A bead of cold sweat slid down his spine, not from temperature, but from the ghost of the Dubai incident 2 years prior, a near career-ending misstep. This time, he could not afford another. Mr. Wei could arrive any minute. The Chinese billionaire wasn't merely an investor. He was the last lifeline that could pull Arthur from the whirlpool. Arthur had prepared every detail, from the placement of flowers to the precise tilt of each chair, to craft a flawless impression. And then, Eleanor Vance appeared. She was pushing a service cart, hair neatly tied back, silver gray, uniform crisp, her soft-soled shoes silent against the marble. But to Arthur, the sight was a spreading ink stain on pure silk. A black woman in the VIP lobby, seconds before he greeted the most powerful investor in Asia? Unthinkable. In his world, appearance mattered as much, if not more, than competence. Get her out of here. Now. Immediately. He murmured to his assistant, his tone sharp enough to feel like an eviction notice. Tension coiled tighter as the sound of polished leather footsteps echoed closer. Mr. Wei entered first, leading his entourage, clad in a bespoke deep blue suit, his face as unreadable as stone. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly, dense and heavy enough to slice. Arthur drew a deep breath, fixing on the practice smile he had worn all morning. He stepped forward, pulling out his phone with its AI translation app, his weapon for bridging the language gap. He spoke his greeting, tapped the button, and then disaster. The app emitted a garbled Mandarin phrase, the mechanical voice cheerfully declaring, "What's up, boss? Let's get this bread." One heartbeat of chilling silence. Mr. Wei's aide bowed slightly, trying to hide a smirk. Mr. Wei's eyes shifted from curious to icy, as if a door in his mind had just slammed shut. Arthur felt the ground crack open beneath him, dragging him into a deep, unlit pit. He wanted to snatch the words back from the air, rewind time by mere seconds. But the first impression had shattered, and with men like Mr. Wei, that was a sentence without appeal. At the edge of the corridor, Eleanor stood still, having witnessed everything. Her deep brown eyes, trained to notice flaws others overlooked, followed every flicker of expression, every pause in the air. And in that moment, as Arthur Sterling felt his grip on power falter, Eleanor knew this could be the turning point. 3 hours before everything unraveled in the lobby of the Pinnacle Grand, Eleanor Vance was on the 48th floor, inside the vast presidential suite. Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gliding across the velvet soft Persian rug until it came to rest on her housekeeping cart. On the top shelf, tucked between bottles of disinfectant spray and neatly folded microfiber cloths, lay a thick, hardbound volume, Advanced Theories of International Trade. The cover was worn, several pages crisply dog-eared as markers. Eleanor read it during every break, as if tending a small, private flame in a world that demanded only repetition and obedience. While wiping down the desk, she softly recited a line of Tang poetry in flawless Mandarin. Not for anyone to hear, no one here cared, but to keep her mind from rusting. The years at Harvard and Peking University hadn't vanished just because she now wore a silver-gray uniform. Moving to the bed, she began arranging pillows, not haphazardly, but in accordance with feng shui principles she knew Mr. Wei, a man who valued tradition, would appreciate. Each of her movements carried the precision of a scholar and the care of an artisan. But here, such qualities were swallowed by the simple facts of her skin color and her job. Eleanor knew this too well. As a black woman in New York's luxury hospitality world, she existed on the periphery of vision. Managers rarely remembered her name. Some guests, though polite, let their gaze pass over her a fraction too quickly, as if she were part of the furniture. To them, she was a pair of capable hands, not a thinking mind. This job had never been a dream. 3 years earlier, her mother, the woman who had raised her alone, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. An experimental treatment in New York was her only chance, but the cost was staggering. Eleanor sold her small Brooklyn apartment, her old car, even her prized collection of rare books. Still, it wasn't enough. She needed a job with weekly pay and decent tips. The Pinnacle Grand, with its wealthy, generous guests, was her only option. But to get through the door, she had to swallow her pride whole. She remembered the bitter interviews. One hiring manager glanced at her CV, Harvard, master's from Beijing, then looked up with a pitying smile. Honestly, your credentials are too impressive. They might make your supervisor feel threatened. Others said nothing at all, simply staring through her with that cold, vacant look, where both gender and race became an invisible pane of glass, keeping her from their world. 3 hours later, Eleanor was pushing her cart down the hall toward the VIP lobby when she heard the quick beat of leather shoes. Arthur Sterling's voice came low and urgent. Get her out of here. Now. Immediately. She didn't need to look to know the words were aimed at her. It wasn't new. She had been told before to step out of sight during important moments. They called it protecting the image. She knew what it really meant. But this time was different. She had just reached the edge of the lobby when she heard the translation device spit out that absurd line in Mandarin. What's up, boss? Let's get this bread. Her steps faltered. To some, it might have been a joke. To her, it was a crude insult to a language and culture she had spent years studying and cherishing. A spasm rippled through her. Not pity for Arthur, but anger at such careless disrespect. She knew she could salvage the moment, could speak correctly, and even steer the conversation in a favorable direction. But another image flashed, her mother's medical bills. Arthur Sterling was not a forgiving man. If she interrupted, he could fire her on the spot. That would mean losing the only income keeping her mother in treatment. Silence meant safety, but silence had a cost. Eleanor glanced through the doorway. Mr. Wei stood there, his face like stone, clearly poised to leave. If he crossed that threshold, the deal would die instantly, and with it any chance for Eleanor to be seen for who she truly was in this world. She looked down at her own hands, deep brown skin, calloused knuckles from hours of scrubbing and lifting. In that moment, she saw her mother's face, frail, but with eyes still full of faith. My daughter is the smartest person I've ever known. Eleanor drew a deep breath. The fear inside her shrank to a pinpoint, making room for something else, an unmistakable resolve. She slipped off her gloves and set them neatly on the cart. One hand smoothed back the stray hairs from her face, the other squared her shoulders. Her spine straightened, her gaze locked on the room ahead. The shadow in a silver-gray uniform was about to step into the light. Eleanor didn't storm in like some cinematic figure shattering the scene. She waited. She waited for the moment to grow heavy enough that every word she spoke could not be ignored. Mr. Wei had just turned his back. The gesture was silent but weighted, like a full stop at the end of a contract that had never been signed. One more step, and he would be gone, taking with him not just the deal, but the final impression that the Pinnacle Grand was careless and beneath his standards. Then Eleanor's voice cut through. not loud, but clear and full, slicing into the stone-heavy air. Mr. Wei, perhaps my understanding of the nuances in bilateral investment regulations could be of use to this discussion. Her Mandarin wasn't the kind learned in a few months on a mobile app. It was the sound honed by years of study, immersion, and conversation in native environments. Smooth, precise, carrying the weight of someone who understood that language was not just words. It was a cultural bridge. Arthur Sterling turned first, his face flushed red, anger and confusion mingling, as if he couldn't believe that the black woman in the gray uniform, the one he had just ordered out, would dare insert herself into such a high-level meeting. Mr. Wei stopped mid-step, his dark eyes fixed on Eleanor. In that instant, there was no contempt, only assessment, the kind from someone who had met all sorts of partners but rarely encountered the unexpected. He decided to test her. In an archaic dialect, he asked, "You be usual, be you Changqi." Explain this in the context of 21st century global cooperation. A proverb that even many young Chinese found challenging, let alone an outsider. Eleanor didn't blink. An uncut jade, if not polished, will never become a treasure, she replied in the same dialect, her tone steady and sure. In global business, potential is like uncut jade. It only reaches great value when shaped by vision, perseverance, and, at times, a willingness to take risks. Most importantly, she paused, glancing briefly at Arthur, is the ability to recognize hidden value, even when its outward appearance makes it easy to overlook. The final line was a velvet-sheathed blade, elegant, but aimed directly at the heart. The room fell into absolute silence. A few executives exchanged looks. Some couldn't hide their astonishment. They had never imagined that a black woman in a housekeeping uniform could speak archaic Mandarin fluently, let alone deliver such a nuanced analysis. The corner of Mr. Wei's mouth lifted. Not a polite smile, but genuine acknowledgement. He gave a slow nod. "Sit down." Eleanor stepped forward and took the seat directly across from him. A position Arthur had, minutes earlier, considered untouchable. Arthur tried to interject, his voice hurried. "Ms. Vance could perhaps translate the key points from my presentation." Mr. Wei raised a hand, not to Eleanor, but to silence Arthur. "Forget the presentation. Tell me what you think." The words, in Mandarin, landed like a direct blow to Arthur. And so the conversation continued, not between Arthur and Mr. Wei, but between Eleanor and Mr. Wei. They spoke about cross-border investment trends, the cultural nuances that could make or break a deal, and how to read this silent language in negotiations. Eleanor spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived in two worlds, versed in the rules of American business, while deeply attuned to Asian culture. Arthur sat back, gripping the presentation remote tightly. The Mandarin flowed past him. He couldn't catch it all, only felt each exchange push him further from the center. He had never felt invisible. Meanwhile, Eleanor, the woman he had once considered a visual obstruction, was salvaging the deal and turning him into an unwilling spectator. The balance of power had shifted, and Arthur knew it. The conversation between Eleanor and Mr. Wei gradually drifted beyond the confines of a formal client meeting. From questions about markets and strategy, they moved into deeper territory, subjects only those who had truly crossed the boundaries of multiple cultures could grasp. "You studied in Beijing?" Mr. Wei asked in Mandarin, his voice low but carrying genuine interest. "Yes, and then Harvard," Eleanor replied. He tilted his head slightly, and for the first time, a rare brightness appeared in his eyes. "Which professor guided you in Beijing?" "Professor Lu Ming," she said, and the mere mention of the name shifted the atmosphere in the room. Mr. Wei's smile came, genuine, unlike the diplomatic one he had offered Arthur upon entering. "He was the man who wrote my recommendation to the U.S. exchange program back in 1987. He had a rare gift, the ability to see value where others wouldn't even bother to look." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. In a room full of eyes that had once treated her as invisible, those words were like a gentle touch, reminding her that there were still people in the world who truly saw her. The room's energy had tilted decisively in her favor, but the decisive blow was yet to come. Mr. Wei turned to Arthur. This time, he spoke in English, slowly and clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear. Mr. Sterling, I have built a global empire on one principle: recognizing value where others do not. Tell me, as a management professional, how do you value this woman? The question was a velvet-coated bullet. It did not ask about her title, nor her tasks. It asked about her worth. And Arthur instantly knew it was a trap. The honest answer would indict him. The wrong answer would expose his blindness. He swallowed hard, eyes scanning the room for sympathy. None came. She, Ms. Vance, is a recent hire in our executive management training program, Arthur said, his voice hoarse and unsteady. A blatant lie, and everyone knew it. Mr. Wade didn't expose him outright. Instead, his gaze drifted quietly from Arthur's Armani suit to Eleanor's silver-gray uniform, then back to Arthur. The silence was thick, heavy, and far more damning than any spoken accusation. Finally, he turned back to Eleanor. Ms. Vance, I'm not inviting you to apply. I am creating a position for you, Vice President of Cross-Cultural Strategy, based at our New York headquarters. The contract will be sent to you tomorrow morning. The entire room froze. There was no applause, but the glances said it all. Eleanor had just been publicly acknowledged in the very place where, minutes earlier, she'd been treated as an obstruction. Arthur tried to speak. Eleanor, Ms. Vance, I made an oversight. She looked straight at him. No anger, no resentment, just a calm, steady gaze tinged with something worse for him: pity. To Arthur, it was harsher than any rebuke. Mr. Wei rose, extending his hand to Arthur, a final gesture of formality to seal the hotel's contract. But as their hands met, he leaned in, his voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Our partnership will continue, but my team will only work with leaders who have integrity. I trust you will make the necessary personnel changes. It was not advice. It was a sentence. And Arthur understood that while the contract was signed, his career was over. In that room, every eye now turned to Eleanor. The black woman who had shattered every preconception, reclaimed her voice, and forced the entire system to acknowledge her worth. The conference room door closed behind Mr. Wei's entourage. The faint squeak of the hinge sounded like a long exhale at the end of an act. Inside, Arthur Sterling still sat at the head of the polished walnut table, shoulders slumped, his hand gripping the presentation remote, as if letting go would mean admitting he had lost everything. The grand room suddenly felt hollow. Rows of leather chairs, the gleaming table, the massive LED screen on the wall, all looked like abandoned props from a play whose lead had left the stage. No one turned back to look at Arthur. He was no longer the center, just a shadow left behind in a silence, so thick it pressed against the skin. Outside, Eleanor stepped onto the marble corridor. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Today's chapter had ended in that room, but her life was opening into something new. Her footsteps landed steadily on the stone, like the heartbeat of someone who had just risen from deep water. With each step, she was leaving behind not just a room, but years of being reduced to an anonymous silhouette. The walnut-paneled walls, the towering crystal chandeliers, the expensive white orchids, once symbols of a power she didn't belong to, were now just the backdrop to a departure made entirely on her own terms. She paused at a large mirror by the hallway's bend. The woman staring back was no longer the black housekeeper in a silver-gray uniform. No longer the quiet shadow retreating into corners to protect the image for someone else. Before her now was Eleanor Vance, scholar, strategist, and a woman who had just forced an entire room of power brokers to acknowledge her true worth. Her fingers brushed the cheap plastic name tag pinned to her chest. Vance, housekeeping. It had sat on her uniform every day, reducing her to a function. Today, it was a relic, no longer a reflection of who she was. She moved to the large window overlooking the street. New York stretched out below, honking horns, voices, the scent of coffee drifting from the Starbucks on the corner. The world outside rushed on, unaware that just a few floors above, a quiet but decisive coup had taken place. Eleanor pulled out her phone. The screen lit with a photo of her and her mother on a sunny day in Prospect Park. Her mother smiling, silver hair lifted by the breeze, eyes full of faith. Eleanor's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. Everything she had just done, she had done for that woman. She typed a message. "Mom, I think we're going to be okay now." She hit send. A small action, carrying an entire world, love, hope, and the promise that the fight to keep their dignity had been won. Behind her, Arthur Sterling sat frozen, hearing the door shut, hearing Eleanor's footsteps fade, and knowing it was the sound of power leaving his grasp. He had lost the deal, lost his credibility, and lost the illusion of being untouchable. In that moment, Arthur understood something he had never considered. Power without integrity was nothing more than a sandcastle, beautiful but fragile, and only one well-timed wave away from collapse. Eleanor pushed open the grand doors of the Pinnacle Grand. The midday light poured in, so bright she had to squint. But she didn't turn away. She let it cover her face, as if to acknowledge she had stepped out of the shadows. There was no applause, no confetti. But true victory needed no audience. It lived in the quiet certainty of not staying silent in the face of injustice, in knowing that intellect and courage had proven true worth could never be hidden under prejudice. She melted into the stream of people on the street, her heart light, as though shedding a weight carried for years. Her mother would hear the good news, and she knew that from today on, no one would ever have the right to define her by skin color, uniform, or job title again. Dignity had returned, and the dawn of a new life had begun. Some battles need no gunfire, only a glance, a timely word, and the courage to break the silence. Eleanor Vance, a black woman once rendered invisible in her own workplace, had stood up, not with anger, but with intellect and dignity. This story reminds us, true worth is not in the uniform you wear or the title on your badge. It is in who you are, in your ability to step into the light, even when everything around you tries to keep you in the dark. If Eleanor's story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Like and share to spread this message. And subscribe to Toch Story so you don't miss more stories where justice, courage, and humanity prevail.